It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck, and of course that means some smart talk radio is in your future, and this segment no exception. We have talked about the 9/11 attacks before, but not in a way as personal as this one. Our special guest this segment is Kristen Breitweiser. She is a 9/11 widow. She is also very much involved keeping the memory of that event and doing research on that event and making sure that you, the public, know as much as you possibly can. She's an activist on the subject. She works with a group of other 9/11 widows known as the Jersey Girls or Jersey Widows, and she is very passionate about the subject, and we will let her tell her story. Kristen, how are you, my friend?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
Well, this is not ever an easy subject to talk about, but Kristen, if you would, give us a little bit, the Lewis at Large listeners here, a little bit of the setup about the situation and the 9/11. We'll get ultimately talking about Jersey Girls and Jersey Widows, but tell us your particular personal story about this event.
My husband, Ron, was 39. He worked in Tower 2, the World Trade Center. He was a money manager for a fiduciary trust company, and together we had a daughter who was 2 years old. On the morning of September 11th. She's now 17. And my husband called me on the morning of September 11th after the plane hit the first building and told me what had happened and said that he didn't want me to worry, that he was safe, that he was okay, that it wasn't his building. And we talked for a few minutes longer, and then we got off the phone. And I continued to watch the television and saw the plane slice into his building, and I never spoke to him again. So, in the years after the attacks, I met up with some other widows whose husbands were killed that day, and we wanted to know that there would be an investigation and that the failures that occurred on the morning of September 11th would be addressed and fixed so that going forward, no other child and no other family would have to suffer the sort of tragedy that we had suffered on September 11th. And so, we certainly didn't anticipate it being a 15-year journey in trying to make sure that the problems were addressed and fixed and that people were held accountable. But unfortunately, 15 years later, we are still fighting the good fight to make sure that the American public is given all the information that they should be given and that that information is transparent and available, and that people are held accountable for the 9/11 attacks so that justice can be done.
One of the, you can't talk about this incident without talking about what has been publicly revealed about what was known or not known prior to the attack and what was known about what happened that particular morning. If you would share from where you sit, where was the failure or where was the breakdown? Where was the lack of action or initiative on the part of the government anyway in terms of what they knew and what could have been prevented, in your opinion?
I mean, I can't speak so broadly because it's a pretty broad question.
Okay.
And that I could talk to you for hours about that. But what I can speak to you today is about how the way our government handled its relationship with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia certainly affected how the government handled information, suspicious activities that were going on inside this country prior to the September 11th attacks. And had the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia not sort of been considered an ally, considered to be, quote-unquote, hands-off, I think many of the FBI agents who were noticing this activity, seeing these things going on, would not have turned a blind eye. They would have proceeded to investigate. And arguably, a lot of that information could have been capitalized upon to stop the 9/11 attacks.
Do you believe that, I know that you've had, I've seen posts before that you've done with particular consternation with Condoleezza Rice. Do you want to share some of that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, listen, Condoleezza Rice, I can't speak to her specifically with regard to the Saudis, but what I can tell you is that, she was a national security advisor of the United States on the morning of September 11th. And, she made a statement early on that no one could have believed that planes could be used as missiles. And that's just completely an ignorant statement. Either she was lying or she's incompetent in saying that because, if you go back and look at all the intelligence files and the information for years before the 9/11 attacks, there were certainly enough indications, dry runs, and uncovered plots and plans by terrorist groups to hijack planes. Hijacking planes was certainly not a novel idea, and using planes as missiles was certainly not a novel idea. And I'll bring up one simple example. They were worried about it, I think, at the G8 summit in Italy and also at the Atlantic Olympics.
What about, again, let's learn a little bit. We'd like to learn a little bit more about Jersey widows. Share with our listeners, if you would, Kristen, about that, again, with you and other women. Tell us how long it has been around and the kind of things you're continuing to do.
I mean, it essentially started out because New Jersey had lost so many people on the morning of September 11th, and through support groups in the days after, we met up, and we all sort of had these same questions, like, how could this have happened? Our husbands went to work and didn't come home. Like, who is Al-Qaeda? Who is bin Laden? Where were our defenses? Why, my husband was told to stay at his desk on the morning of September 11th. He should have been told to evacuate. And questions as simple as that to why did the buildings collapse, to why weren't F-16 scrambled in time to intercept the planes, to how these people got into the country with the visas, to, why did FBI investigations get shut down prior to September 11th that were investigating these people? Questions, even after the September 11th attacks, why were Saudis allowed to fly out of the country? Why, to this day are, any investigation into the Saudis verboten and considered to be, not permitted because it's, you're not allowed to go there. So, all of those things sort of came up. We all started asking questions, and we turned, obviously, to our government to say, will you investigate this? Will you give us some answers as to how this happened, why it happened? And will you assure us going forward that nothing like this would ever happen again? And what we found was a lot of foot-dragging, a lot of cover-up, and a lot of obstruction in our effort to learn and fix problems. And so we found that frustrating, and, we fought for the 9/11 Commission. We got the commission established, but unfortunately the commission was completely compromised, and it did not provide a complete accounting of the attacks. And to this day, we're still fighting so that people understand that we are not being told the complete truth about the attacks. There is still information that is being withheld from us, and that going forward, if we truly want to be safe, if we truly want to know that our elected officials are making decisions in our best interest, we need to be given that information. And, you can't be an informed, engaged American citizen if you're kept in the dark.
If you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio, and talking today to Kristen Breitweiser. She's a 9/11 widow and activist. She and other widows have a group called Jersey Girls or Jersey Widows. They have worked very, very hard to keep not only the memory, but pressing forward to make sure that 9/11 information about that continues to come forward, and no matter how they have to do the plumbing and wire around or through various things. Kristen, again, the former 9/11 commissioners like John Lehman, Senator Bob Kerrey, and others have all of them acknowledged that the Saudis, as you mentioned earlier, were not adequately investigated by the 9/11 Commission. And again, that raises the point, is that ignorance? Is that an oversight of it to be possible? Or was that, do you believe, by design?
Listen, the reality is this. Number one, the Saudis are a hands-off entity. They are very good at throwing money around Washington. They are very good at offering very nice jobs, as consultants to go and work for them and get paid a lot of money. And, for a time they were selling us oil at a very nice price. So for years, there's sort of been this entrenched relationship in Washington between the United States and the Saudis. And whenever the Saudis did something that, a regular person would be outraged by, it was sort of like you were supposed to look the other way. You weren't supposed to raise questions. And so, this wasn't just a Bush administration problem. I know a lot of people would be more than happy to say, Bandar Bush, Bush did it. The reality is that our relationship with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia spans decades. And, if you want to look to where it started with regard to 9/11, it started during the Clinton administration when FBI agents were trying to look into some of the suspicious activity in San Diego and Los Angeles or Sarasota, Florida, or Phoenix, Arizona, or Minneapolis, and they were told to look the other way. And as a result of them looking the other way, these people continued plotting and planning and were able to carry out the 9/11 attacks. After the 9/11 attacks, when the Congress created its own investigation called the Joint Inquiry, the FBI was not cooperative in sharing everything that they had. The Bush administration was not cooperating and pressuring the Joint Inquiry to not investigate and ask questions to the Saudis. And even 15 years later, you have an Obama administration who, again, is not willing to examine and answer some of these questions that are raised in these 29 pages. So, when you want to talk about the 9/11 Commission, what you had was a staff director named Phil Zelikow who, fired an investigator who went over to the 9/11 Commission specifically to investigate the Saudis and their link to the 9/11 attacks, and she was fired by the staff director, Phil Zelikow. Thereafter, when the Commission's final report was to be written, Zelikow rewrote the entire section on the Saudi involvement in the 9/11 attacks, making it seem like they did nothing. And I'm here to tell you that if you read the 29 pages, you will see that the Saudis are all over the 9/11 attacks. It's 29 pages that discuss the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and its connection to the hijackers. It doesn't mention Iraq. It doesn't mention Syria. It doesn't mention Iran or Afghanistan or Pakistan. It is 29 full pages of Saudi involvement, giving financial and logistical support to the 9/11 hijackers. Now, how President Obama and various other people in our government could say that there's quote-unquote no there there, I don't quite understand that. And I would just say to anyone listening, go to 28pages.org, get yourself a highlighter, print out those pages, and read them yourself. Don't take my word for it. And when you're reading, if there's anything that you find disturbing, highlight it. And by the time you get to the end of the 29 pages, review back and look at how many things you've highlighted. And then ask yourself the question, does that sound like a government who should be considered our ally? Does that sound like a government who we should be giving weapons to? And, if you're of my mind, you're going to read that and be very disturbed. And you're going to have a lot of questions. And you're going to wonder why this information was kept away from the American public. Because the truth of the matter is, if this information was given to us back in 2003, it's arguable to say that we would not have gone to war in Iraq. Hundreds of thousands of lives would not have been lost in Iraq, and billions of dollars would not have been spent in Iraq. So when you really think about the implications, not just the 3,000 people that were killed on September 11th and that the Saudis have not been held accountable for that, you also need to think more broadly and consider the war in Iraq would likely not have happened. We would not be selling $100 billion of weapons to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia this very day. We wouldn't be making the sort of foreign policy decisions that this country is making. And had the Saudis been held accountable in 2003, you have to ask yourself the very serious question as to whether ISIS would be where it is today. Because without Saudi funding of terrorist groups cannot survive.
Who besides you, Jersey Widows and people like yourself, who's leading this charge? Who else is telling the same story?
Certainly no one in the government. And, I find that reprehensible. I don't understand why anyone in the U.S. government is not equally as outraged as anyone else who reads the 29 pages. And the answer is because they're beholden to the Saudis. They want to continue their relationship where they get, $25 million donations to foundations or $10 million donations to presidential libraries or what have you. And it's reprehensible because at the end of the day, it's you and me. It's us that end up getting killed in these terrorist attacks, whose families and loved ones, are the ones who are injured and suffer the most. And we need to put a stop to it. We need to demand that our government gives us the information that we are rightfully entitled to so that we can force our government to make the right, the correct, the sound, the most secure foreign policy decisions, community decisions to protect us, not, their future financial benefit.
And it sounds to me like what you're saying is this certainly transcends Republican Party or Democratic Party, and that it's pretty much comprehensive across all inside the Beltway.
That's exactly it. I wish I could tell you it was a one-party problem. It's not. This spans decades. It's Democrats and it's Republicans. And the problem is that it's an insidious relationship. It's like a heroin addiction. And I can tell you this: we are the only ones. We, being the regular public citizens, are the only ones who are hurt by it.
Talk to us a little bit more. I did not ask you this at the beginning. I should have. Did you and your husband, do you have children?
Yeah, we have a 2-year, my daughter was 2 on the morning of September 11th, and she's now 17. And
I'm interested as to her observations. I know you can't really speak for her, but in general, when she described, there's all kinds of children that have lost fathers and mothers, but not in such an extraordinary way. I'm curious, from your position as a mother, how has it affected her?
That's why the women and myself started doing what we did so soon after the attacks, asking questions so that we could learn lessons, because we didn't want any other child to have to grow up without a parent, to have to know the searing pain of seeing your dad or your mom blown up in a building, over and over and over again on television, and to witness that horror. And, the truth of the matter is the 9/11 attacks could have been prevented, and they should have been prevented. And I know enough about just the intelligence failures on behalf of the CIA and the FBI and the NSA to tell you that they could have been prevented. And so that's a very painful thing for any person, let alone a child, to have to grow up to acknowledge that their parent didn't have to die. And then beyond that, it's difficult to come to understand why the government, your own government, who's supposed to protect you, is not willing to fully investigate and hold people accountable for your loved one's murder. And I think that that's something that all of our kids struggle with. They don't understand why their government, their own president, why President Obama, doesn't want to hold the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia accountable for their role in the 9/11 attacks. And that's a very hard thing for a kid to understand. You grow up being told, you can trust your government and your government will protect you. And many of the kids from 9/11 don't get to think that way because they've lived the reality of what it's like to lose a parent on 9/11 and see that 15 years later, no one's been held accountable.
We've had no less than 2 members of the FBI and one with the CIA on this show over the years, very much echoing exactly what you're saying, that what was known at the time, and matter of fact, one of our guests actually sent a memo saying these activities are going on, and this was several months prior to the attack. But anyway, off of that, what about as part of Kristen, as part of Jersey Widows, do these children, do they see one another? Do they have any kind of relationship with each other?
We've all sort of spread out in the tri-state area, so we don't all live close to each other anymore. And honestly, my daughter was the youngest, so she's 17. All the other kids are now moved on, and they're in and out of college and moving on with their lives. So, but we're still a family, our own family, and we will always be. the other widows' children are my children, and my daughter is their daughter. And we will always look out and take care of each other because we have something between us that will be the bond that'll keep us together for the rest of our lives. So, you know, in essence, my daughter lost having a father on the morning of September 11th, but she gained a lot of brothers and sisters that she probably would have never had, and a lot of, you know, additional moms that she, or aunts, or however you want to say it, that she certainly would never have had. And so, you know, we were able to survive, we were able to carry on, and all of our kids are wonderful kids. They're great kids, and they just had to learn a very, very hard lesson way too soon in life.
Again, we're with Kristen Breitweiser, 9/11 widow and activist, has worked tirelessly for a decade and a half now on the subject of what really happened that day. Her organization is Jersey Widows. Kristen, as we kind of start to wind down here a little bit, is there anything in particular within this subject that you're working on as we speak, sort of in late summer 2016, anything that's got your focus more, any particular activity or any particular communications that you're working on?
Right now, the 9/11 families are fighting for some legislation in Washington. It's called JASTA, the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act. And what it will do is remove sovereign immunity for any nation that participates in a mass terrorist attack. Right now, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, even given all of the evidence that we have to prove that they had a hand in the 9/11 attacks, is immune from being held accountable because they're considered an ally. They have sovereign immunity. So the 9/11 families have legislation pending in Congress to remove that shield of sovereign immunity for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and any nation that funds mass terrorist attacks. And it passed the Senate earlier in the spring with unanimous consent. It's bipartisan legislation. It's obviously for a noble reason. It's to help stop terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda from getting money so that they can kill innocent people. And the legislation is currently pending in the House. And anyone listening, you can call your congressman and tell them to co-sponsor H.R. 3815. And in the alternative, call Kevin McCarthy, who's the House Majority Leader, or Paul Ryan, who is the Speaker of the House, and tell them that you want them to put JASTA to a vote as soon as possible, because you want to know that our Congress is doing everything that they can to keep us safe from terrorist attacks. And that's our only hope at this point, because after 15 years, we no longer have faith in the government investigating and holding the Saudis accountable. So we've turned to the judicial process, and with any hope at all, we will be able to get the Saudis in court. We will begin the discovery process, and it'll be an open court, which means all of the evidence, all of the paperwork will be given to the American public so that the American public can see the truth.
I know you're not here to get political at all, and I'm trying to keep this away from a political question, but just in general, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, would you see either one of those candidates being somewhat receptive and more willing to pursue this versus the other one?
I think both candidates did support the release of the 28 pages, and the most recent that I've heard is that both candidates do support this legislation, this JASTA that we're fighting for. Obviously, our biggest concern, any candidate who's received funding from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, because you obviously worry with anything when people are given money, they're expected to do something in return. So obviously we have reservations with any candidate, whether that's a senatorial candidate or a House congressman or, a presidential candidate. If they've received money through a PAC or to their foundation or to a library, it raises our eyebrows because we worry what is expected in return. But as I said, right now, I would say both candidates are supportive. and I hope that they both remain so.
Kristen, we'll start to wind down here again. Would you share, if you would, ways people can find out more about 9/11 widows, or Jersey widows, rather, and information about this subject of 9/11 and the research and the work that you're doing? And if you've got also a website where you publish things, blogs, etc., please share that as well.
Sure. The best thing anyone can do is to just educate themselves. And so to do that, go to 28pages.org and read the 29 pages yourself and highlight the sections that disturb you, that you find alarming. And when you go back and you see all of those highlighted areas, do something about it. Tell your friends to read the pages. Write a letter to your local newspaper. Call your congressman and senator and tell them that you want to know that your government is holding the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia accountable and that anyone who was involved in the 9/11 attacks should be held accountable and that the American public should be given access to all of the information surrounding the attacks.
Well, Kristen Breitweiser, again, 9/11 widow and a member of Jersey Widows, working tirelessly here to try to find some kind of resolution and maybe never complete closure, but some type of closure about 9/11 in particular as it relates to the Saudis. But we'll be very anxious to follow the work that you do. Thank you so much for the work that you do and also for being on this show today, and would love to have you on again.
Listen, thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.